So I celebrated my 31st year as a Dallas police officer here this past August. I just recall back in 1983 when I started, I came here with an afro, and this is what 31 years of policing has done. But I also came here into a policing culture of let's put them all in jail and let God sort them out. That was the policing culture I came into, and it was across the American policing. This culture of let's incarcerate as many people who are causing public disorder and committing crimes as possible. So throughout the 80s, my rookie years, and throughout the 90s, that had been the sentiment amongst American policing in almost all cities across this country. And it peaked, I think, in the 90s, where we came into this really high crime in most major cities, the big cities with the million populations, some of the highest crime rates in many, many years in the 90s. And it really tracked really well with our put them all in jail, let God sort them out sentiment, which is counterintuitive. If you are putting them all in jail and God's sorting them out, why are our crime rates continuing to spiral? And that has been the takeaway from the American policing experience throughout the 80s and 90s, is that incarceration may not be the better way to police. And so the advent of this idea of community policing came to the forefront in the 90s. And I became a first-line supervisor during that time, and I could just tell you there was much pushback from rank and file and first-line supervision of this idea of hugging a thug, right? Being nice to folks that would do us all harm. And so it really didn't catch much traction. We continued to incarcerate quite a few people. There was some experimentation throughout the country with community policing, and you saw some success. But then at the very beginning, and New York's going to take the lead in the city of New York with its CompStat, which is really cops on every block, that police presence. And it really is the precursor in the 90s to stop and frisk. And that really was the advent of American policing, from the high incarceration rates in the 90s into the 2000s of this, we just need to hire more cops, breaking the budgets of most cities. And so for cops, we really like the idea of having a whole lot of other folks with us to do our job. Crime rates began to fall, not tracking much with the decline of high incarceration rates, which began in the 2000s, the very beginnings of it, and reaching its peak in the later 2000s, 2008, 2009, 2010. I became police chief in 2010 here in Dallas, and I began this mantra of the best way to reduce crime is to prevent it from happening in the first place, which was a new idea and different than community policing without any metrics. It was community policing trying to figure out a way to measure success, not just sitting having coffee with neighborhood groups, but trying to take away outcomes from interacting with the community in different ways. And I could just tell you that it still continues to be a struggle. And so a couple of other ideas I'd like to really put out to you that's really catching on with American police chiefs in the policing environment in general is this idea of procedural justice and legitimacy. And I'm glad Mark mentioned Ferguson, because that's the image that I'm sure you all can relate to much more than just me telling you about the struggles of policing neighborhoods and some of the things that happen when we have to use force. So if you just keep the image of Ferguson in your mind, and then you listen to me talk about procedural justice and legitimacy, I think it can really come forward for you. What I'm trying to convey is that no matter what police action you take, what types of police force you have, large, small, or even what your philosophies are, if the community doesn't trust you, you will have outcomes like Ferguson. And whether there's a large news coverage of the outcome like Ferguson or none at all, trust between communities and police is like a ballistic vest. It's like any tool you have, but if you don't have trust, the rest really doesn't matter, is that you do have public disorder. It's so fragile, this trust. It's so difficult to earn with the community because there's a historical perspective in some communities that may have happened in the mid-'60s, where grandmothers and grandfathers tell these stories in the communities about how the police abused them. And just one incident that's similar to what happened, it was "I told you so." And rumors and non-factual scenarios and narratives become the fact. And that's what you're dealing with, regardless of what a grand jury might say. This idea of I got a historical perspective between community policing relationships in these tough communities, mostly people of color, where when an incident happens, we fall back almost by default to what's happened to relive this history from the 60s and 70s, where police earned this reputation of not treating these communities in the best ways. And so this idea of procedural justice and legitimacy is, police actions, use of force ought to be hand in hand with quite a bit of community engagement programs where many times only the police department can go in these communities because of safety issues to engage community members, particularly our youth, try to break this cycle. The biggest failure we have as a society and as a police department is when we have to make that arrest. That goes in that person's record. Now they can't get hired. If it's a felony, now they can't vote. I mean, it is the down spiraling of that neighborhood once you make a single arrest, because we'll be chasing that one person around for the next 30 years. We do hotspot policing in our city. We've had the most dramatic reduction in crime with hotspot policing in our city over the last decade. If I were to end the year right now, it would be over a decade, a 60% reduction in crime. Our crime rates are similar to the crime rates in the 1950s and 60s. And I was born in 1960, so I remember leaving your door open in Dallas. But you don't feel that way because the perception of crime is really real crime to you, whether there's statistical support for your perceptions or not. And so we've had this great success, and really I always throw out this one figure, the homicide rate, which is what's less manipulated by folks, right? You can't hide the bodies. So our homicide rates are the lowest in Dallas's history. You wouldn't know that because, every homicide leads the news, but it is the lowest in Dallas's history. In the 70s, we averaged 300 murders a year. In the 80s, we averaged 300 murders a year. In the 90s, we peaked in 1991 with 500 murders in 1 year. This morning, I get emails on every murder in this city every morning. This morning, at this point in the year, we've had 88 murders, from a high in 1991 of 500 murders in 1 year in Dallas. So that's equivalent to what the homicide rate was in 1930. We have records back to 1930. I'm a little bit of a nerd on this stuff, so don't let me bore you too much with these numbers. But it's just amazing to try to explain. We're incarcerating fewer people. The police departments and the policing profession is leaning more than it ever has toward community engagement, community policing, and the crime rates are the lowest they've been in 5 decades. And just compare that with how I started with lock 'em up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the highest crime rates in the city. So what is justice? It's procedural. It's how you treat people. What is legitimacy? It's how you've engaged people before you have to use force. If it's all you're doing as a police department is going in and arresting folks, and you have no other types of relationships, you're going to relive the historical perspective of the communities where you're making an arrest. You're going to relive it over and over. It's going to look like you haven't made any progress, even though statistically you may have some of the lowest crime rates that we've seen. You know, I speak at police graduations. I did yesterday. I speak at police promotional, trying to encourage and just kind of dropping little thoughts like I'm doing today. I speak at police retirements, and I have the unfortunate task of speaking at police funerals when police officers die for various reasons. And there's a really good lesson learned when you speak to the audience and then you talk later about the policing experience, because you get it from the newest recruit to the person who came in maybe 40 years ago into this profession. And so much has changed. You're likely to be on camera, whereas when I go to a retirement, none of what they did was caught on camera. You're likely to have Freedom of Information Act requests on your work product criticized more likely than it would have been when we had everything on paper and not electronic. And so the scrutiny and the hyper scrutiny of our profession really has placed us at a crossroads as a profession. The lack of trust in government in general has made its way to American policing. And that's why there's this hue and cry for body cameras for every officer on every interaction with the public. And I try to convey this to recruits and to the newly promoted folks, is that just assume you're going to be on camera and assume that footage is going to be edited to the worst portion of that interaction, replayed over and over, going viral, and all of the like. And I take it all back to trust, legitimacy, and procedural justice. The best cities will figure out how to gain trust with the communities they are tasked with policing, so that even in the toughest neighborhoods, when you have to make an arrest, you walk away with strong relationships and trust from those communities that the only interaction, this is not the only interaction you've had with that community. So we do a lot of youth programs in the Dallas Police Department. We have dedicated a lot of resources, a lot of people, a lot of officers that go and they coach and they interact as part of their job. And we see that as important as arresting a bad guy. And I'm a DISD product. That's the Dallas Independent School District. So this is a joke. So you don't have to have a private school education to figure this out. We arrest 50,000 people a year in our department, just our officers. Our county jail holds 5,000 people. So just do the math, and the arrest them all and let God sort them out, it's just not smart, because there's not enough room. So you have to do things to prevent crime and breaking the cycle of crime. And I could just tell you, we cops like to take all the credit, but I could tell you the economic development of a city can render it as safe as hiring 100,000 cops, because it changes the dynamic of the neighborhood, where people have jobs, when people have economic opportunities, when there's decent housing, when there's transportation available. When I'm interviewed by a reporter like Mark, I don't give none of those things credit. I just say this to the police officers that made this city safe this year. But at the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I hope the jig is not up and everybody figures out that we have to have a lot of economic development for policing. Who would think that, if you don't know Dallas, Uptown was one of the most dangerous areas of this city in the 50s and 60s. You wouldn't go to Uptown with anything less than 4 officers. And now I can ride my bike to Uptown, and I feel good about going to Uptown. I wish I could afford to live there, right? Right. So, I just want to close with this idea of the best way to render a city safe is to prevent crime from happening in the first place. That the experiment of high incarceration rates was a failure by the metrics, just the outcomes, look at the highest crime rates and the highest points of incarceration, and look at today, we have very low incarceration rates and the lowest crime. Police departments have had to adjust to this idea of community policing, this idea of legitimacy, and just, even though it doesn't look like that when you look at Ferguson, but it is the takeaway from Ferguson from every department in this country is that we better get more involved in these neighborhoods so that we have someone to talk to when we have a police shooting or other use of force where an officer didn't do something or it's perceived that they didn't do something that they were supposed to do. You better have contacts with the faith-based community in those neighborhoods. You better have contacts with the leadership from the grassroots organizations so that you can have conversations and not protest. And when you do have to take action, everyone understands why you did, and they trust that you took only the action that was appropriate. So I don't know what the rest of the format is, but that's my spiel, and I'm sticking to it.